Hello, my name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions.
And I'm Proven Paradox, a guy with a lot of questions.
And you're listening to Bright on Buddhism, a podcast where we discuss East Asian Buddhism, answering listener-submitted questions from listeners just like you, and introducing concepts of Buddhism that you may or may not be familiar with in a casual, conversational setting. Enjoy.
Here, are there any Buddhist martial practices?
There are, but not because the Buddha taught martial arts to anyone. They simply have developed as a result of followers of the Buddha simultaneously developing martial practices.
I suppose that makes sense. Just as Buddhism accepts local customs when it travels, it would also accept and respond to the interests of its followers. A warrior may hear the Dharma as clearly as any other sentient being. Are there any martial practices that are compatible with the Buddhist teaching?
This is a much more interesting question. One answer is no, there are not, because the Buddha teaches nonviolence against all sentient beings, so there couldn't possibly be a martial practice, by definition violent, that reconciles with the teaching of ahimsa, nonviolence. Another answer is yes, there are martial arts that are compatible, but only in how they are used. If they're used in the defense of the Buddha, his teaching, or his community of followers, then they would be deemed righteous and not incompatible with his teaching.
I see. That's interesting. What does the Buddha teach about so-called righteous violence?
Admittedly, not much. It is taught among his followers that defense of the teaching, its followers, and its propagators against detractors is righteous. However, I'm dubious of this teaching being true or being compatible with the doctrine of nonviolence.
In a world where everyone acted according to the Dharma, or to a being that has the wisdom and supernatural skills displayed in the sutras, I think that is true. In this world, populated by mere humans, who act based on delusion and are burdened by dukkha, I think there are many problems that we cannot solve in a manner the Buddha would consider skillful.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Bright on Buddhism. This week we will be discussing martial arts and Buddhism. What is the relationship between Buddhism and martial arts? What are some Buddhist-influenced martial arts and their histories? How does the practice of martial arts reconcile with the moral precept of not harming sentient beings? We hope you enjoy.
So let's begin. What is the relationship between Buddhism and martial arts?
It's important to note, right here at the top, that textually there isn't one. There is little to no martial arts talk in any of the sutras in the Pali or Taisho canons. If there is any, it is in some histories and some Chinese Buddhist documents that are mentioning that this or that monk practiced martial arts at this or that time. Because of this, there's no single martial arts tradition that has any specific significance in the Buddhist texts. The relationship that does exist is one of culture and history rather than of text and doctrine. In other words, rather than following certain Buddhist texts or doctrines to train in martial arts, Buddhist martial artists in history have simply been Buddhists and have shaped their martial arts practice according to that religiosity. That may seem like a distinction that isn't really a distinction, but it is, and it is the most important one for understanding Buddhism and martial arts. When Mahayana Buddhism developed and spread in China in the 1st through 6th centuries CE, something new began to occur that hadn't previously occurred in Buddhist history. Monks would have practices, skills, or hobbies that were separate from their monastic lives. The reason for this is that doctrinal and ritual developments in Mahayana Buddhism left extra room for monastics to have a life outside of their monastic duties and roles due to doctrines that reframed morality and practice, at least compared to earlier Buddhism in India. We have frequently talked about how in Chinese Mahayana, temples began to grow their own food, save money, own land, and integrate with the wealthy elite. They also began to practice skills unrelated to Buddhism, such as calligraphy, Confucian study, poetry, painting, and more. Indeed, Buddhist institutions in China became very wealthy and political, leading to the 4 persecutions of Buddhism that we talked about in episode 43. In relaxing the precepts for monastics, many temples had farmlands, schools, and members who were closely tied to the elite. Monks would be second sons of powerful nobility and thus have strong loyalties to their family. They would also create other connections as tutors for wealthy children, religious advisors for government officials, or as monks who fulfilled ritual needs like weddings, funerals, births, and more for the ruling class. Thus, many came to be suspicious of Buddhist temples and institutions on the grounds of corruption and excessive wealth and influence. These activities even led to some Buddhist temples keeping standing armies. This is an interesting phenomenon that, in my opinion, does not get examined enough in scholarship. Starting in basically the 3rd century onward, the main temple of a particular school or lineage would usually have an army of several dozen, 100, or even 1,000 warriors whose purpose was, nominally, to protect the temple from bandits and raiders, but whose de facto purpose was essentially to be an auxiliary military force for whoever the head monks sought to ally with in the ruling class. The true origins of the monastic soldiers is unclear. Major temples and shrines hired armed guards to protect the temple from local banditry and malcontents, and the terms of this agreement were that, while these armed guards worked for the temple and were paid by the temple, they were not monks themselves. Somewhere along the way, these companies of lay warriors ended up receiving ordination. Or maybe monks from temples started joining these companies of soldiers or being recruited by them, in addition to being monastics. Eventually, entire companies of these armed guards developed. At some point, some also became ordained monks. Over time, the number of monks who also acted as soldiers and security increased, eventually reaching a point where all of the guards were ordained. These would be analogous to being a lay brother or sister to a Christian church in Europe in medieval times. It's not clear, but the result was bands of soldiers who were ordained monks. Importantly, these guys were not hired by the higher ecclesiastical authorities, and their actions did not always reflect the affiliations and agendas of the temples themselves, which would prove catastrophic for these temples, especially during the persecutions. These soldier monks obviously trained in the use of weapons and in hand-to-hand combat, and that led to the splitting off of temple lineages who trained in martial arts as a hobby or a skill or a tradition of practice.
What are some Buddhist-influenced martial arts and their histories?
For the sake of this episode, we'll discuss the famous Shaolin Monastery, which is the most notorious and the longest-lived example of a Buddhist martial art, so much so that in many Western fantasy settings and media, the word monk is more closely associated with martial artists than members of the monastery. Next, we will talk about the development of so-called inner practices that developed around the 18th and 19th centuries in China. And then we'll discuss Aikido, the martial art that I trained in Japan for several years and which got me into the academic study of Buddhism. These are all three very interesting martial arts traditions with interesting relationships to Buddhism, both practically, historically, and doctrinally. These introductions will be incredibly cursory for the sake of time, so I will miss stuff. Eventually, these martial arts will likely get episodes of their own to themselves. The Shaolin Monastery is located in the Hunan province of China and was founded at least as early as 495 CE by the Chan Buddhist monk Buddhabhadra. This monk was sponsored by the Emperor Shaowen of Northern Wei to establish a translation house in China for translating texts from Pali and Sanskrit into Chinese. Incidentally, he and his disciples, Huigang and Sung Cho, brought with them training in martial arts, for reasons that aren't really clear in the English language scholarship. It's possible that they did it for fitness, for familial reasons, for entertainment, or for some combination of all of these. Maybe they were even soldiers or fighters before renouncing and becoming monks. I don't know, and the English language scholarship doesn't really know either. Regardless, by the 6th century CE, what we now call Shaolin Kung Fu started being practiced at this monastery. This martial art involves repetitive body exercises to increase flexibility, conditioning, and hardness of the body. One of the oldest groups of exercises is actually called the Arhat's 18 Hands, known in Chinese as the Luohan Shiba Shou. These are a series of forms and movements based on imitating Arhat statues that were built at the Shaolin Temple. It also involves breathing and meditative training to increase lung capacity and increase the flow of qi, or life force, or vital energy, as well as increase calmness and speed of mind, and increase tactical and strategic knowledge. In perfecting and developing these forms, the monks at Shaolin even participated as soldier monks in the unrest that resulted from the change of the Sui dynasty to the Tang dynasty in the 8th century. They even won some victories in battle during that time. From then on to the 15th century, the monastery goes sort of quiet, not participating in any major conflicts, but regardless, continuing to gain fame and mythical status across China. Eventually, they start to figure a lot in Romantic literature from the Ming dynasty, which was in around the 1300s. not romantic as in love stories, but as in melodramatic and romanticized. From then on to the modern era, they became the standard for Buddhist-influenced martial arts practice. All the while, they study and practice Chan Buddhism, and their meditation and martial arts practices are inextricably linked. Because of the Chan connection, there has been a legend out there that Bodhidharma, the first Chinese patriarch of Chan Buddhism or Zen Buddhism, invented or founded Shaolin. We've talked in the past about Bodhidharma's martial arts skill and his hardcore nature. However, this legend has been debunked. Bodhidharma was not involved with Shaolin at all. Later in the Qing dynasty, or the 17th century, there appears this distinction in the literature between inner martial arts and external martial arts. External martial arts is for people to make their bodies fit and to be effective at maiming or killing. Inner martial arts, or neijia in Chinese, is for the cultivation of mindfulness, strong life force, wisdom, and other qualities that might be more becoming of a Taoist sage than a Buddhist. Some have speculated that the pioneer of this distinction, Huang Zongxi, made this distinction for political reasons. Buddhist martial arts like Shaolin Kung Fu were regarded as external, because Buddhism was a foreign religion, and inner ones were identified with Taoism because Taoism is an indigenous religion. So keep in mind that there might be some nationalistic or ethnocentric themes in this categorization. Nevertheless, external martial arts would be kickboxing, Krav Maga, or Western wrestling. Inner martial arts would be Tai Chi, Aikido, and Qigong. In my opinion, certain kinds of Kung Fu bridge this gap, but that does not start to be the case until after the Qing dynasty. As an example of an inner martial art, we can look at Tai Chi. The characters for Tai Chi are Tai, which means stalwart, grand, magnificent, and excellent, and Chi, which means extreme culmination or zenith. Usually there is also the character Chuan at the end, which means fist or boxing. So the full name means Grand Culmination Boxing or Grand Excellent Fist. It was pioneered by 16th century monks at Buddhist and Taoist monasteries as a form of Taoist inner alchemy and Chan Buddhist meditative movement. It centers on the manipulation of qi. The practice looks like slow movements with mindful slow breathing, and I've heard it explained that it is actually just very slowed down martial arts moves. The reason that it's slowed down is to create a meditative movement situation, but also to train one in the breathing and qi manipulation that's necessary for the adequate performance of Tai Chi. That means that in theory, it can be performed at higher speed and to great martial efficacy. Tai Chi is a very popular exercise for elderly people in China today. Oftentimes in China, you will see groups of elderly folk training in Tai Chi very early in the morning outside. It's very good for posture and breathing, and it's very low impact and safe. Many practice it the same way that Westerners practice yoga. Next we come to Aikido, a relatively young Japanese martial art. Aikido was founded by Ueshiba Morihei, who lived from 1883 to 1969. Ueshiba Morihei is an interesting fellow, to say the least. He'll likely get his own episode on the Research Project series. He was a very pro-imperialist figure, being a member of a Shinto nationalist new religious movement, serving in the Japanese military, and being a settler colonizer in Hokkaido. He served in the Japanese army during the Russo-Japanese War, and after being discharged in 1907, he moved to Hokkaido as the head of a pioneer settlement sponsored by the government to displace the natives. There he met Takeda Sokaku, the headmaster of Daitoryu Aikijujutsu. This is an empty-hand martial arts tradition that has a lineage going back to the Heian period among the samurai. After leaving Hokkaido in 1919, Ueshiba joined the O-Motokyo ultranationalist Shinto new religious movement. Later in 1925, he allegedly had a spiritual experience stating that, quote, "I felt the universe suddenly quake, and a golden spirit sprang up from the ground, veiled my body, and changed my body into a golden one. At the same time, my body became light. I was able to understand the whispering of the birds and was aware of the mind of God, the creator of the universe. At that moment, I was enlightened. The source of Buddho, the martial way, is God's love, the spirit of loving protection for all beings. Buddho is not the felling of an opponent by force, nor is it a tool to lead the world to destruction with arms. True Buddho is to accept the spirit of the universe, keep the peace of the world, correctly produce, protect, and cultivate all beings in nature." Unquote. After this experience, his martial arts technique became a lot gentler, with a greater emphasis on the manipulation of ki, the Japanese rendition of Chinese qi. Soon after, he began teaching Aikido in the form that we know it today. The word Aikido consists of 3 characters: I, meaning harmonization, Ki, meaning Qi as in Chinese, and Do, meaning the way of practice. So the whole name means the way of practice of harmonizing Ki, or the way of practicing to achieve harmony with Ki. As you can see from his spiritual experience, there are themes of non-violence against all sentient beings and the harmonization with the divine. As a result, the martial art itself came to rely less on strikes, punches, and kicks, and more on body throws, joint locks, and other non-violent means of suppressing these attacks that you might encounter. It became rather defensive rather than offensive, in the sense that the result or the goal was that nobody ever got hurt whenever they were in an encounter that involved martial arts. If somebody punches you, you don't want to hurt them back. You want to stop them from punching you again by restraining their fist, by pinning them to the ground until they change their mind, or by something like that. The branch of Aikido that I trained was called Shinshin Toitsu Aikido, which was pioneered by Ueshiba Morihei's top student, Tohei Koichi, in the 1960s. To make a long story short, Tohei Koichi ascended to the highest possible rank in mainline Aikido, but he had several misgivings with how Ueshiba Morihei taught. Likely due to his spiritual experience, all of his teaching was very esoteric and spiritual, and it could only be understood by actually feeling it. For example, in order to understand how to complete a throw the way that Morihei wanted you to, he had to actually do it to you, and that's how you would feel it. Tohei eventually started teaching it on his own, but with his own explanations and descriptions for things, alienating him from Ueshiba's children, who were set to inherit leadership of the organization. When Ueshiba died, he had already at that point named Tohei as his chief instructor, and had awarded him the highest possible rank. However, Tohei left to start his own martial arts tradition to emphasize the nature of Ki. He softened the martial art even more, and he included several elements that were non-martial, such as breathing techniques, meditation techniques, chanting, and ritual ablution in water. These rituals were shared with Buddhism and Shinto, and through learning more about them, I discovered the rabbit hole of Japanese religions and history, and I pursued that as a career path. I'll always be thankful for the effort, concern, and energy that my teachers and my companions poured into me along the way. I would never have visited Japan if not for Aikido. However, I have since left Aikido. I still maintain a great deal of respect and veneration for the teachers and companions I had while I trained, but I've realized that Aikido is not for me at this stage in my life.
How does the practice of martial arts reconcile with the moral precept of not harming sentient beings?
We've already seen a number of explanations and justifications that invoked Budo, or the way of the warrior, or the way of fighting. Budo is a concept referring to the values, virtues, and character traits that martial artists, fighters, warriors, etc. should cultivate. These things include stoic calmness, mercy, a lack of malice, strength, resolve, etc. One of the seemingly contradictory characteristics that you should cultivate with Budo is an attitude of nonviolence, or otherwise benevolence. This essentially translates to treating your fighting skill as an absolute last resort. In some situation, you have exhausted all other possible ways of resolving and/or de-escalating it, and so in order to defend somebody who is otherwise helpless, defenseless, or in need, you finally use martial arts or fighting only to the extent that is necessary. This ideal has mythological status in martial arts communities. People will get the characters for Budo tattooed on themselves. They'll treat it like a religion and read books about it and meditate on it and make it their entire life. It's very similar to European knightly chivalry. The way it reconciles with nonviolence is that you're treating fighting as a last resort. You're never fighting out of malice, anger, or greed, and you're using fighting only defensively, never offensively. While this is the ideal, I don't think it has ever actually been achieved and worked out that way in real life. For one thing, I think that it is contradictory to use a martial art that involves punching, striking, and kicking and pretend like you're being defensive in some way. I'm not doubting the necessity of punching, hitting, and kicking, but I am incredibly doubtful that you can call that defensive in the true sense of the Budo ideal. This is especially true if the training involves weapons. The true sense of the Budo ideal is not to fight, and that reconciles nicely with nonviolence. But Budo is in many ways the philosophy with which one approaches fighting. So if you are fighting, you're already failing at Budo. Moreover, if you're training in a martial art that emphasizes Budo, you're likely deriving joy, fulfillment, and fun out of the martial arts aspect. So you have fun fighting, but you're supposed to avoid it unless it's a last resort? I doubt people's ability to actually live that way in real life. Furthermore, I want to step back here and talk a little bit about Budo's colonial and imperial roots and its toxic masculine nature. People think that Budo, or Bushido, have this very close historical relationship with the samurai, the mercenary fighters of Japanese history. However, this is entirely untrue. Budo and Bushido are in some ways a myth. They're invented terms that did not exist on a large scale before the turn of the 20th century. Before that time, they were descriptive terms for people who practiced various forms of fighting. That person is a warrior or a bushi, so they practice the way of training in warrior arts, or bushido. It's like saying that person is a swimmer. They practice swimming do, where swimming do refers to practicing different strokes, holding one's breath, etc. In the 20th century, a very pro-colonization Japanese imperialist named Nitobe Inazo wrote this English-language treatise that claimed that Bushido was the soul of the Japanese people, and he added all of this extra fluff to it about honor, loyalty, fighting to the last man, woman, and child, and much more. He wanted to represent all Japanese people as being vicious warriors and pave over them with this scary masculine ideal that was not real in any way. His purpose in doing so was to convince the rest of the world that Japan ought not to be colonized because they were all samurais and would fight too hard, and it would be too much losses on both sides. European powers had colonized other Asian countries and had regarded the West as universally masculine and the East as universally feminine. And so, Nitobe Inazo wanted to reverse that image for Japan. Thus, he co-opted this term and added a bunch of stuff to it to present Japan to the West in a particular way that wasn't actually reflective of reality. This was a scare tactic. Not every man, woman, and child in Japan has the spirit of the samurai. In a way, this scare tactic was successful because Japan was never colonized by European powers. Nevertheless, this popularized the idea of Bushido in the West and led to it creating a completely false image of Japanese culture and people in the Western mind. It is not a warrior culture. All of this honor and loyalty stuff is complete hogwash. Historically, the spirit of the samurai is to prioritize survival first, your paycheck second. If a battle isn't going your way, or if your patron's pockets aren't deep enough, you change sides, you retreat, or you quit and find a new patron. You really just do whatever makes you more rich than you currently are, even if that includes doing violence. That's not really a great way to approach life, in my opinion.
There's another parallel it has with the European idea of knightly chivalry.
Exactly. Let's come back around to the inner martial arts, or the Neijia. These martial arts are more like meditative movement, similar to mudras, so they do not need to reconcile with the doctrine of nonviolence in the same way that other martial arts do. They're not really presented or practiced in terms of their martial applicability. There definitely was a time in history where they were, but definitely not anymore. In history, soldier monks simply did not reconcile their role as soldier monks with nonviolence. They believed that Buddhism was accepting and helpful for all people, even hunters, butchers, and soldiers who spent their life killing. In that sense, they had to do extra rituals or maybe have extra faith in the Buddha's compassion for them, but otherwise, they did not do any special theoretical or textual justifications for their actions. Furthermore, in several Buddhist schools and lineages, righteous violence is regarded as being far more okay than malicious and self-centered violence. In other words, if somebody is being threatening to Buddhism, to a Buddhist society, or to a Buddhist monarch, then defensive violence is actually historically regarded and doctrinally regarded sometimes as righteous. When you're a soldier monk, then you're uniquely situated to be able to say, these guys are threatening the Sangha, we need to kill them, and then be the ones to kill them. Additionally, if somebody is advancing an agenda that is counter to Buddhist doctrine or law through violence, then violence is regarded as a permissible answer to that. You can use violence to put that down and call yourself a defender of the Dharma, which is a very meritorious position to be in. Finally, I just want to note that while doctrine against violence may exist, people historically have just simply not followed it without making any attempt to justify their not following it. There's also a Christian commandment about not killing, but the Crusades still happened. Real-life human violence rarely, if ever, answers or attempts to answer to religious text and doctrine, and accept that it's just wrong. Crusaders theorized that they were going to heaven because they had died defending the cross from heresy, even though that is directly contradictory to the commandment against killing. Buddhist soldiers and warriors in history have said they were going to the Pure Land or to heaven because they killed righteously or faithfully. It's rare that somebody willingly admits that they broke a rule and will be punished cosmically for it. The reality is that human beings kill each other, have always killed, and will always kill regardless of religion or law, and attempting to situate that religiously is just purely futile in any context.
I've said in previous episodes that religions are made of people, and people make compromises. It's going to be the same with violence.
Exactly. We hope you enjoyed this week's discussion on martial arts and Buddhism. Join us next week where we will be doing a deep dive into Amitabha. Who is Amitabha? What are some stories about him? How ought we understand him? We hope to see you there.
See you next time.
Thanks for listening. If you would like to support the show, we ask instead that you send that support to the Trevor Project, a nonprofit that focuses on suicide prevention efforts for LGBTQ youth. My name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions and the voice of Hearer.
And I'm Docs, editor, question asker, and voice of Hermit.
And this has been Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have any questions that you'd like us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. Please consider leaving a comment, review, or subscribing. You can also reach us by email at bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com. As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you.